I guess I would, since I've called the meeting to order, ask that the roll be called.
Mr. McGorry?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Mr. Pajali?
Here.
Mr. Whalen?
Here.
Ms. Castile? Mr. Zuloff?
Here.
And Mr. Jackson?
Not here. Do we need to excuse either of those two individuals?
You ask that every time.
We can't.
I don't think we have to. We can. We don't.
Okay.
It's required by this for the city commission, not for us. I don't
Okay.
think.
All right. Well, I'm not going to worry about that then.
Good.
I think we still have a quorum, so we'll proceed. First item of business on the agenda today is approval of the minutes of the February 23rd City Planning Commission meeting. Has everybody had a chance to read those, and is there a motion to approve?
Mr. Chairman, I'll move to approve.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Thank you, gentlemen. All in favor of approving the minutes from the February 23rd meeting as submitted?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, they've been approved. The next item on the agenda is a public hearing for an application for an amendment to the zoning map along Wildman Avenue, or Wildman Avenue, I guess. I keep thinking that if it's Wildman, I might want to move there. But, and First Street, I guess that's been withdrawn.
That has been. I'll take over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a brief update on this first application for everyone tonight. As you had stated, it is withdrawn. The applicant contacted us this morning to withdraw their application due to some facts that we had determined from the public on a past application. So a lot of First Street was already rezoned back in February of 2021. City Commission approved this on February 22nd in 2021. So the most relevant addresses were also part of what was included, which was 1900 through 1922 First Street. And I'll show you an image here in a second. But based on our research, it seems that a staff member that's not in our department anymore was involved with this, and before his departure didn't update our zoning map properly. So we were not able to recall what was, I guess at the time that the applicant was putting the application in, what had happened. So we luckily have an update to fix it. So this was what was originally proposed. Highlighted in the blue rectangle was what they wanted to rezone to commercial recreation, which is the red, except for the crossed out parcels, which were privately owned. And now this is what the zoning map currently looks like. We updated it this morning based on the information that was determined. So there was only 3 parcels that were still part of the applicant's application that were relevant. So they decided to withdraw. It sounds like they don't have an anticipation to reapply in the future, but we'll see. But as it stands, this application is not relevant for tonight's meeting anymore.
Thank you for the explanation.
You're welcome.
I guess move on to the next item of business. It's new business, under new business. A site plan application by Rio Holdings LLC for an addition to an existing building at 1019 Pierce Street with a parcel number I won't bother reading. Perhaps staff, we've all reviewed that paperwork, but perhaps staff could further explain it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The applicant's proposing an expansion of their existing medical operations. The site is currently zoned commercial service. The adjacent zoning to the north is R1 40 single-family residential. To the east is commercial service, to the west is commercial service, and to the south is both residential multifamily and also public facilities. It's currently used as a recovery center and a detox center, and they plan on expanding that use, which is permitted here. The site currently sits on just under an acre. The total building coverage is 5.9%. The existing structure totals about 2,500 square feet. The proposed addition adds just under 3,000 square feet, totaling just under 5,500 of medical office space, bringing the total lot coverage to 12.6%, which is well under the 50% threshold. The proposal is adding 14 new parking spaces to the top here in the gray at the top of the site plan, totaling 42 spaces on the site, and the existing parking coverage is 8,910 square feet. The addition will give the Recovery Institute of Ohio more space to expand their offices and also more floor area for patients. The proposal is 16 beds with 18 bedrooms. Each bedroom has an adjoining bathroom for patients. There will be consultation rooms, a kitchen addition, and some small office spaces built in. The plan is to have some patients stay overnight as needed for treatment, and that's a case-by-case basis. And the time frame in which the patients would stay on site is unknown by staff. And the site plan proposal meets all applicable zoning requirements with the exception of the landscaping, which I will touch on here in a second. So we'll start with parking requirements. The existing parking spots well surpasses the 27 spaces required with 42 total now. So according to city records, the first phase of this project did not have any landscaping requirements attached, or if so, they were not followed by the applicant. There's no record showing that there was any requirements. So based on that, staff would recommend the applicant install landscaping, not require them to, in the combination of trees and shrubs along the southern edge, right next to the public right-of-way in the first addition parking lot. Now, staff would require trees to be added to the new phasing of the northern parking lot, because that is required per the code. So based on that, other departments didn't have any negative concerns or comments for this. So based on that, staff recommends the approval of the site plan at 1019 Pierce Street with the following conditions. And condition 1 is that all applicable permits are obtained through the building department, engineering department, planning department, and the other applicable agency. And the condition number 2 is that a combination of trees and shrubs are installed along the western edge of the new parking area.
Thank you, Mr. Oakes. I have a question then. So the addition of some landscaping along the southern, along Pierce Street, we can't require that. You're
Correct, that's
okay.
correct, yep.
Do you know whether the applicant is amenable to doing some landscaping along the front edge on Pierce Street?
I am unaware on exactly where they would stand on this, unfortunately. I thought they were going to be here tonight. They may be, but that's something they could possibly touch on if they are here.
Okay. Is anybody here on this site plan application? Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I have a question about that, too. It would seem we're working on the same site, and that regardless of what the prior standard was, it would seem that the overall plan would be held to current standards. So I think you'd have the option of at least, if there's a standard for a % of green space or landscaping and it can be met, that is an option to hold the overall site to that. I don't think you are required to, or even are advised to necessarily pretend it's two separate lots. I don't know, but that's the way I think it's been practiced in the past too, is that you don't get to ignore everything that's been done on the site when you're adding to the site. I think maybe the law director could weigh in if, or maybe he has to get back to us on that.
That would be my question too. I suppose we could arbitrarily say we're not going to approve this unless you do this, but if it's not a condition of the expansion, I don't know if we can really do that in fairness, let alone in legality. So now it would be nice if they said, sure, we'll do that as part of the landscaping project, and maybe in comparison to the entire project, that would not increase much, especially since they're going to have to do some landscaping. But if the law director, do you have any comment on this at this point?
Not at this particular moment, but if you'd like, we can prepare like a really quick answer to that question if it would be helpful.
Well,
Sounds like it would be in order to make a decision, and we're happy to do that.
What concerns me on this is, I don't know what the time frame on this, if there's no real rush, I suppose we could table this, but once we approve it, it's approved.
Correct.
And we could just ask them to do it, and hopefully they would, and I do agree that that would make the whole thing look nicer along Pierce Street.
When I was, we were, go ahead, we were interpreting the code. I've seen in other cities that a landscape requirement has to get replaced if it dies, and we don't have anything like that. So I wasn't confident saying that because they're building this new addition in the back of the new parking lot, we could require them to do the Pierce Street improvements. So that, I guess this is the big question is, can we tell them that they have to put landscaping on the front of the property that already exists when they're adding onto the back of the property? So that's why we kind of split it. And there's nothing to say that they'd have to put, like the third one where we showed a little cluster of mixed tree and shrub, there's nothing in our landscape requirements that would put something there. We just think it would beautify the site if they did the whole west edge and the southern edge.
So forgetting the south border on Pierce Street, if we approve the application, are we approving it with that one that would make it look nicer, but we can't really require it?
So the two that are in the red box at the top left that are along the west edge of the site where they're doing the site improvements, where they're doing the parking lot, those are required. So that was the condition, that they at least do the west edge of the new parking area.
Okay. I mean, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm following all this discussion, and it's my general impression that it's customary to have a representative here to support an application. In the absence of anybody to answer that question, are you amenable or not, I wouldn't mind getting that question answered before we take action on this.
Well, here's my compromise proposal. The thought would be to approve the application with the requirement that the front along Pierce Street be upgraded to what would be required today if we had the same requirements, and approve it that way. And if they object, then they have to bring, I guess, back to us or take it to the city commission. I mean, they aren't here, and I don't know what's more important to them, holding this off a month or.
I understand your point. I was also sensitive to your concern that the legalities that we maybe couldn't require that, and it
Yeah.
sounds like you're prepared to require it and see what happens.
We would just make that a condition of the approval. I mean, that's my thought, and leave it up to them, and they may say, that's perfectly fine, happy to move forward.
Can we get a legal opinion on that?
You can, but I would like a little bit of time to make sure that it's correct and not jump off the top of my head.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Zullo.
I kind of lean toward what you're suggesting, although I'd be satisfied if overall standards were met with getting less detailed into where they put the tree. If the site plan calls for, 4 trees or so many square feet, just make sure it's there somewhere, and my guess is it'd be easier to add some landscaping at the front to achieve that, but if the ordinance says, has standards, we don't have a real good reason for deviating from those, and I think that it's not asking a lot to, in absence of an argument to the contrary, it's not asking a lot to just meet the standards for the site. So we're kind of almost on the same page, except I'm giving them a little more flexibility.
Yeah, I'm just going to restate, I think we have 3 alternatives. Table it until we get an answer on whether they are amenable to that, which holds it up at least a month. Approve the application without the Pierce Street landscaping and just ask them to do it, and maybe they will. Or make it conditional upon including the Pierce Street and see what happens. And if we really aren't authorized to do that, if they don't object, then I guess there's not a problem. Or if they do object, I guess that would be removed. I mean, that's the way I would assess what the consequences could be. So those are our three options as I see them. I'm least in favor of tabling it.
No, I agree, we don't have any good
I
reason.
have a question. So if we approve it with the condition that they disagree with, can they just resubmit next month? That seems like,
I would think they
It would be
could
more of
just
an appeal
challenge
type thing.
the
Well, then is that-
legality, yeah,
so then they're,
of that. I think, quite honestly, I think the
I would be all
If I-
for that,
if I
but
may,
now
I'm-
we're saying, okay, they're gonna need to get a lawyer to get rid of it.
No, you can, if you reject a site plan,
It goes to BZA, I believe.
you can submit a new site plan. You can't say, well, you can't do anything because we rejected your site plan. You're more or less forced to
If I
propose an
may add,
alternative.
I believe the appeals process goes through BZA after this. If the applicant were to appeal something, I would like to double check on that, but that's what I recall. So,
Right. But shy of an appeal, I'm not even talking about an appeal. If you reject it, they have the option of overcoming the objection and submitting an amended plan, of
But we're not
course.
talking about rejecting, we're talking about approving with conditions that they might not like.
Are you asking,
Well-
sorry, if I may, Chair, Mr. Zuloff, are you asking on appeal if they revise their plan, can that be accepted on appeal? I wasn't sure what your question was.
No, we're confusing appeal with, okay. If you fail to approve a plan, right, they obviously can resubmit an amended plan. Are we all clear on that?
If you, like, what do you mean by fail to approve?
We say
I don't
no-
understand what your question
if
is.
you
You're not
say-
being very clear.
I don't know how it could be more clear. If you do not approve, if you
Reject, if you vote down.
reject a plan, they obviously don't go home and can't build the building. They go home and they're free to appeal, of course,
Sure.
but they're also free to resubmit an amended plan to overcome what objections there might be. It makes no sense that you would.
They would not be precluded from submitting a future plan that is different, correct?
An amended plan, right.
Yeah.
Right, so by the same logic, if you placed conditions on this plan, and there should be no reason why they wouldn't have the option of either accepting the conditions or submitting a different plan that would overcome our objections. So they wouldn't automatically be forced to appeal. They could simply resubmit a new plan, which I think would overcome the chairman's concern that they'd have to appeal. We wouldn't be forcing an appeal. We'd just say, well, go ahead and fix it. Appeal would be only if they want approval for what they've already, if they disagree with our rejection and want approval of what we rejected. And somehow we're confusing that with resubmitting.
Mr. Chairman, I got a question for Mr. Oakes. When you talk to him and you say you suggested or recommended that they do that landscaping, did they seem receptive to it, or did you have a discussion with them? Or?
So since it wasn't a requirement as far as the recommendation, I didn't talk to the applicant
Okay.
further about it. They are aware about the requirement part of it based on our interpretation of the code. Like I said, I assumed that he would be here tonight or she would be here tonight to talk further on this discussion. But unfortunately, they're not.
And I guess my thinking would be if something's approved back here, it's like if I get some plumbing approved in my house and it's been approved and then I move forward and I need my hot water heater replaced, can the plumbing inspector come in and legally make me replace everything in that house? When I had it approved back at this point, and it wasn't in the code. So I don't know, and I guess we go back to a legal question. I don't know, even if we make these recommendations or say that we'd like them to do this. If they say no, do we have an enforcement mechanism to make them do it?
Well, a better analogy would be a site.
Well, I'm sure there's a better analogy.
No, but
What
I
is
mean,
it?
I'm not criticizing your analogy, but the point is that site coverage, you can't, let's say you have new site coverage requirement, limits, right? So you've already got a building on the site. You can't just ignore the building that's already there and say, well, we want to take the remaining land and apply the site coverage to that remaining land on the same site. That's what we're talking about here.
But if it wasn't in the code when it was approved back here, then how can I back up and make them do it when they had approval back here?
I'm not, see, that's why I said,
Yeah.
let them do it any way they want. We have standards for the amount of landscaping.
Yeah.
Don't tell them where to put it, just meet the standards. That's all, that's why I said, don't require, I don't think we should require them to meet the standard in the existing lot. We should just, what we should do, unless we have a good reason not to, is require them to meet the landscaping standard for the entire site.
And let the planning department work their magic to get them to take care of the other stuff we want done, as good citizens. I mean, that might be the approach. I don't know.
It's sort of academic. I mean, I don't care that much.
I'm inclined to make a motion myself. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, please do.
I'm going to make a motion that their site plan application be approved with not only the 2 recommendations by staff, but a 3rd recommendation that they meet the now existing landscaping requirement along the south edge or along Pierce Street. And I'm making that
Second.
motion. Okay, second, okay. I'm making that motion for expediency, not only for the city, but for the applicant. And I don't know that that's what they'd want me to do, but I think they might, so.
Okay.
But by the way, isn't the staff allowed to approve minor changes to a site plan? So just keep that in mind.
So it's been moved and seconded. Any more discussion on that motion?
Two
Ms.
things.
Whalen?
One, not really discussion, but I think that the number on here is probably right and not in here. 4,500 square foot addition, not total. Secondly, I'm assuming that they have either an agreement with the neighbor or a easement down the west side of the property, because they're entering the lot from the adjoining property.
Yeah, that's correct. When I spoke with the applicant, there was an easement in place between the 2 property owners.
Any further questions or discussion? Mr. Miller?
My comment is just repeating what I heard up front. In the scope of things, we're asking for 2 or possibly 3 trees. And in the scope of things, I find it hard to believe that they'd be that resistant to making their project nicer.
Okay. So any further discussion? Otherwise, we'll call a roll on that.
Mr. McGorry?
Yes?
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Pajali?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Okay, it's been passed. Move on to the next item. Under paragraph 4, new business, KG Real Estate owner, Sandusky LLC, has submitted a site plan application for an addition to an existing building at 2401 Cleveland Road. Excuse me, and I won't read the parcel numbers. Mr. Oakes, could you explain a little further to us?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The applicant at this site is proposing an expansion of their vehicle maintenance and vehicle detailing operations. The site is currently zoned commercial service. It's surrounded by commercial service on the west, north, and east boundaries. And then across the railroad tracks, there is R160 single-family residential here. The existing use is a car dealership / maintenance operations for their cars that they're selling, and that's also their proposed use. The site of 2401 Cleveland Road sits on about 170,000 square feet. The total building coverage is 19%, which is well under the 50% threshold requirement. The existing structure here totals about 32,730 square feet, and then they're adding 3,900 square feet for this new maintenance and detailing operation. So the proposed site will now have 5,845 square feet of office, 30,785 square feet of servicing and detailing. The proposal contains 218 parking spaces of what we would call a normal size car, and there's also 42 larger spaces, unknown to what those are, why there's the difference, but that's what staff had figured out based on aerial analysis. The existing parking area is roughly 136,270 square feet of the parcel. No additional parking area is proposed on this site, and I will talk about the parking standards later on. The applicant has stated that this will give Ganley more space to repair and detail cars, which will include 4 new, let me get to the site plan, there we go. 4 new detail bays and an area for a future paint booth. So the same materials will be used to match the existing building. So on to the parking standards. The existing parking spots the existing parking well surpasses the 70 required spaces with over 260 parking spots between what we would call the normal and the larger size spaces. New parking areas must meet landscaping requirements. The new proposal does not call for new parking, so therefore landscaping requirements are not required. And although staff would recommend landscaping to future beautify the site, we cannot enforce it, but we do think this will go a long way in beautifying the site for future needs. No other departments had concerns on the site plan proposed. So based on that, staff recommends the approval of the proposed site plan at 2401 Cleveland Road with the following conditions, and that's that all applicable permits are obtained through the building, engineering, planning, and any other, planning departments and any other applicable agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Oakes. Before I ask whether or not there are any questions to staff, I'd like to ask if anyone is here for the applicant. Do you gentlemen wish to add anything to what's been said so far?
No, I mean, the biggest thing is.
Could you stand and state your name and?
I'm John Decker.
Can
Oh,
you come
go
up
to the mic.
Sorry. Just for the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm John Decker with KG Automotive. The biggest thing since we've purchased the dealership a year ago, we've grown a lot, and the biggest thing is just giving the customers a great experience, and we need this room to be able to have a good process to continue to do that, so.
I think the application is pretty straightforward, so I don't have a lot of questions. Does anybody else on the commission have questions for the applicant or staff? Mr. Bajali.
Mr. Decker, since we have you up here, would you be willing to do that landscaping that they've suggested?
So we planned on doing some landscaping upgrades in the front anyways. Obviously, first priority is customer satisfaction in doing this, but throughout the process, we definitely want to do that, so.
Just a comment, I go by there quite often. I think you run a nice operation out there, and I think it looks good, and it looks to me like everything you do is really well done, and appreciate the fact that you're willing to update the building and put more investment into that property.
Yeah, we're excited to be there, so.
Thanks for coming into the town.
Yep, no problem at all.
Any other questions on the commission? Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
If there's no further questions, anybody care to make a motion?
I would like to move the approval subject to staff conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Second?
Mr. Bajali seconded. Any discussion on the motion now that it's been moved and seconded? And just for clarification, that's on with the recommendation of staff, the one recommendation, completion of all permits and through the building department, engineering, and any other applicable agency.
Yes.
Hearing no further comment, I guess call the roll on that motion.
Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Bajali?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Motion is passed. And finally, or I guess not finally, but on to the next item of business. The Sandusky State Theater, Inc. has submitted a site plan application for an addition to an existing building, the State Theater, at 107 Columbus Avenue, and again, I will not read the parcel numbers. If staff could educate us a little further on that.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The applicant's proposing to add additional theater support spaces onto the building and then also a reconstruction of their former historic stage house. The site is zoned downtown business district and it's surrounded by downtown business district in all directions. The existing use is the State Theater and they propose to extend on that use as a State Theater. This site is located on 3 different parcels. The parcels total about 34,000 square feet. The existing structure and building additions total roughly just under the entire site at 33,344 square feet. The applicant proposes a restoration and expansion of the existing theater stage house and in addition for additional theater support spaces. The proposed total building lot coverage is around 99%. The proposed gross floor area is 66,000 square feet. The addition is going to include a screened built-in area for dumpster location to be accessed by the adjacent city right-of-way. There's no parking requirement for this property as it's located in the central business district. No parking is proposed on the site other than the continued use of the existing loading dock on the site. The proposed building height is to match the existing 70 feet, which is under the 125 feet a maximum requirement for downtown business district. There are no lot coverage limitations for non-residential structures in downtown business district, so the 99% is permittable. And then the application in the project meets all applicable zoning requirements. So based on that, other departments didn't have any concerns on this project. Staff is excited to see the proposed expansion after many years of the restoration of the Sandusky State Theater. This is a landmark to our downtown and a key attraction for visitors. So we hope that this work will keep bringing more and more tourists to our downtown. So staff recommends the approval of the proposed site plan at 107 Columbus Avenue with the following conditions, and that is that all applicable permits are obtained through the building, engineering, and planning departments and any other applicable agency.
Thank you, Mr. Oakes. Before asking for any comments or questions from commission, I think someone's here for the applicant. Wish to add anything further? For the
Mr.
record,
Chairman, Chris Parthmore, Chris Parthmore, Sandusky State Theater Executive Director. It's been an internal conversation for some decades at the theater, long before I was there, to expand the stage to be able to provide larger and a bigger variety of shows to the area. One of the features of a 1928 vaudeville house is a very thin stage without a lot of depth to it, and that's been a hindrance for a long time for the theater. This tragedy gives us the opportunity to do that. And in addition to that stage expansion, if you're going to expand the stage, you do need more support area backstage for those shows as well. So that is what we're looking at.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming today, and I appreciate everything you do at the state. So I have no questions. It seems pretty straightforward to me. Anybody have questions of
Mr.
staff?
Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Zula.
I'm looking at the site plan here, and I'm curious about the proposed service road. What does that mean? That looks like it's part of the city parking lot.
You're talking about a loading dock that acts.
No, I'm not talking about the loading dock. I'm talking about the city parking lot where it's labeled, I don't know if anybody looked at the site plan, but it says proposed service road. Can anybody explain what that is?
Yeah, if I may. The architects weren't sure if that was going to remain access in perpetuity, so they wrote in there that the proposed road to show that access needs to remain in order to get through that alley to maintain trash and et cetera. One question they had for us is if we move forward as a city to look for redevelopment on the parking lot adjacent there, if we get a hotel at a parking garage like we've looked for, that access would remain because that's how they're planning their services. They're kind of back of house, and which is the intention that's in the downtown plan, that access would remain. It's an important pedestrian and vehicle connection to Water Street. And if there ever were a time where the city was going to remove that access, we would have to figure out how to make sure that trash service continued to exist. So I believe that's why they marked it in that way on the site plan, but they are not proposing to do anything outside of their.
Okay, thank you. I think I understand what you're saying. So, and by the way, then we now have the building right to the applicant's lot line, right?
Correct.
And I'm not seeing any encroachments, is that correct?
Correct.
It would seem that it might be appropriate to either, because we have lost an alley, maybe two in that block. It might be appropriate to dedicate an alley or grant a easement or something just to ensure, that something crazy doesn't happen in the future. It would be an additional action, of course, and either this body or could propose it, or the staff could propose it, but it would seem prudent to do something permanent. If it was a private enterprise, or it's a not-for-profit, but it's a private enterprise. In absence of maybe an easement by necessity or something, some kind of contentious kind of argument, there would be no real obligation in the future. We can't obligate the city by saying, yeah, sure, don't worry about it, we'll take care of you. But I would be in favor of granting either a permanent easement or dedicating an alley or something like that, just because I think it's the right thing to do.
Through the chair, thank you for that comment. From the staff perspective, I recommend not making action at this time for that reason, because we have a almost perfect rectangle on the Jackson Street parking lot site, and that's rare and it's big, and it gives us a lot of flexibility to design something, which the site plan would go back and forth, because the city owns that. So I would hesitate to specify exactly where that perpetual easement or connectivity might go at this time, but I think that you're on the right track. I totally agree that connectivity is important.
Well, one way to
and
do
now
it would be to, the easement would at minimum give the theater a leg to stand on in the case that, it got contentious in the future. So I don't see why the theater would insist on the exact same access, but they obviously are going to need some access back there. Or maybe they don't. I haven't really, maybe that refuse disposal might have other alternatives or something like that. But I would, if I was a state theater, I would really be trying really hard to protect myself in the future from some unknown situation or decision. Just a comment, this is not really going to get in the way of approving this, but.
Would anybody care to make a motion on this application?
Motion to approve, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Mr. Bajali seconded. Any further discussion on the motion?
Mr.
And
Chairman,
this is conditioned on the staff
Right.
recommendation for the.
at least my second, yes.
But basically permits, acquiring our applicable.
Yeah, all applicable permits, which arguably is, if that's the only condition, they got to do that anyway, so.
Right.
All right, yes, of course,
Okay. Any further comment or discussion on the motion?
Mr. Chairman, I had a quick question for Mr. Parthomore. If, this is going to get approved this evening, when do you think the construction will take place? It may have been in here, maybe I missed it.
Hopefully, my board will approve that tomorrow, but the intention is sometime in April.
Okay, good. One other quick question, and I might be putting you on the spot, and you don't have to answer if you don't want, but I hear so much about parking problems in the downtown with that Columbus Avenue, the second look at Columbus Ave that we're going to have here. What are your impression of? Do you have a lot of parking problems, or what's been your experience?
Well, we're not expanding our seating, and as we sit, we can fit 6% of the population of Sandusky into our building, and I have yet to see a major parking problem. If we have a great show, people are going to be able to walk a couple blocks to it. The way I look at it is, if you go to a Cavs game, there's nowhere that you're parking that you're not walking the length of downtown Sandusky to go into that game. If we have the right entertainment, it's not a problem.
Okay, I appreciate your thoughts.
You're going a full block just to go to the mall in the best parking spot in the lot.
We didn't vote yet, right?
Yeah.
Call the question.
Call the
Okay,
question.
call the roll.
Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Bajali?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen? Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Thank you. Congratulations and good luck, and can't wait.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Very
I
excited.
got so enthralled in your discussion about parking in the downtown that I forgot where we were. Next item on the agenda is we're moving on to other business, and it's a continued discussion of transient rental regulation. I'm not sure who chooses to speak on this first, so. Ms. Blair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We wanted to do one thing, so you made a motion last time for Mr. Miller and Mr. Whalen and staff to sit down and talk about potential regulation options to move forward. So we do have two options to get your feedback on today and to see what you want us to move forward with. We also wanted to give a little context because there's some statewide attention going on right now about the future of transient rental, or what is more commonly referred to as short-term rental regulation. So we just wanted to give you a little context on that. And I think Mr. Howell has done a little bit of a deep dive on this too, if you have questions. But currently in the House, there's been a bill introduced. It was introduced in February, so just 1 month ago. It's about 25% of the way through the process, so no guarantees. But there's a bill in the House that suggests that cities would only be allowed to regulate short-term rentals the same as any regulation for long-term rentals, basically taking away the municipality's right to regulate, put a cap on them or designate them to specific areas. So what they want to do is basically equate them as the same thing as a long-term rental. So it would prohibit communities from banning paid stays of 30 days or less at condos, apartments, or houses, and it would bar placing any caps. It has some support that's supported by the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the Ohio Real Estate Investors Association. There's other states that have passed similar legislation, so there's some nationwide precedent. Arizona, Florida, and Indiana have approved similar laws within the last year or two, and there's similar legislation pending in Michigan. That's been pending for about a year, so there's no telling if this will actually go all the way through. I do know that some cities have started writing letters of opposition. It's been through, I think it's in the state and local government committee hearings process right now, and there's been some pushback, and they're also getting a lot of support. It's a partisan bill. It's got I don't remember how many backers, a whole bunch of Republican backers. And I'm not sure if there's been any Democratic leaders that have spoken out in favor or against. I don't know that I've heard that. So that's just a little bit of context. So it seemed to me, one of the analyses I read is that it's not clear what would happen to regulations that are in place in cities. I think the intention of the bill is to wipe those, they're not even enforceable, but I don't know if they've written it enough that they would take away everything that we have in place. That's unclear.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. It is, the current legislative text is vague enough that it is a little unclear if it would apply to zoning requirements for transient rental. As I think you are all aware, our transient rental regulation is a zoning regulation. It's in our zoning code. This appears that it may conflict with that, but it is not precisely written. It is not. It is a bill that is at its core designed to truly hamper local regulation of short-term rentals, and it is therefore written pretty broadly, and it is intended to it does and is intended to conflict with our home rule authority. So there's a number of open questions about what this would do, whether it is even constitutional. I think my opinion is it's not, but I'm not a court, so I don't get to make that final decision. But we just wanted to bring it to your attention because it is something that has been introduced. It does have a lot of real estate backers, including short-term rental companies, obviously, but also some other real estate players. And it is been introduced in the legislature, so we just wanted to kind of make people aware. And if you do have any questions about some of the more specifics, it's not a very long bill. So it's one of the few times that, I might actually recommend that if you're interested, you can actually read it. It's only a few paragraphs, but it's pretty broad in scope. And that's why we wanted to just highlight it, since we are talking about transient rental generally.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
I
Mr. Zullo.
thank the law director for getting ahead of this. That was my first question. What about home rule? And it struck me as like flying in the face of that principle. So, and I didn't even know, I thought home rule was in the Constitution. So this would seemingly, at least, at minimum seemingly, I know you're not the court, but seemingly conflict with the Constitution.
That's correct. And I think.
And it might be well known by the authors too, that
Yes.
it would only apply, it might, that home rule cities could choose to override it. So on one hand, it might be sort of like, maybe we should wait and see what happens. On the other hand, we may also take the view that we can kind of ignore this, at least for now. And also, what we have is a new poster child for special interest legislation.
True. Regarding the home rule question, if I will tell you I probably would imagine it would be universal among municipal attorneys that this is a direct violation of the home rule addition to the Ohio Constitution, which you're correct is in the Ohio Constitution, and that's where we derive our home rule authority from. So our local ordinance would supersede this. However, I will say that the way that home rule litigation has played out over the last decade or two has not been favorable to municipalities. So that is why I say it is somewhat of an open question as to what a court would decide and we've had some pretty staggering blows to the home rule authority that previously would have been pretty much sacrosanct in the legal community. So in that regard, it is an open question. And actually, if you look at the Ohio Legislative Services Commission analysis, it literally highlights that. Here, I think I can. Their exact comment is the bill may raise an issue under the Ohio Constitution Home Rule Amendment. So it is definitely, as written, potentially conflicting with any local ordinances that home rule municipalities would implement like ours.
My thought is, it's good to know about that, but I still think we should proceed with a game plan on how people can approach the city to obtain transient rental authorization. And we need to come up with a plan, and I think Mr. Wayland's thought initially was a nice format for that, whether the exact parameters stay the same or not. But that's my thought.
And if I may, this is really just informational only. This has been introduced. We're just highlighting it, making the Planning Commission aware that this is a relevant topic coming out of the State House. But yeah, it is not meant. I'm going to defer to the rest of our excellent staff on some of the recommendations that they're discussing. But it's meant to just be informational and answer any questions that you might have about a pending state bill.
So just to recap what I thought we talked about before and what was.
Could I ask one?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Aaron's going to go on a little more.
I realize this is tough to answer, but I'm just questioning your sense of the likelihood and the timing for the potential approval of this House bill. What do you think?
The timing would be months at best. It's still in committee. Although if the legislature really wants to act fast, they find ways to do so. I don't think this is going to be that type of urgency. It's also not the end of their legislative session, so like they have time this year where they will continue to pass bills and consider them in normal process. So I wouldn't imagine that this would be enacted into law anytime soon. The likelihood, I can't handicap that. There are very significant real estate interests that are for it. I think municipalities across Ohio will almost universally come out against it, even if they don't have transient rental rules, just on the principle that they should be able to exercise local self-governance. So I don't know. I don't know what will end up being.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So again, going back to.
Yep.
Did they have more to tell us?
Yeah, we do. So I just we want to have that, like the statewide context convo first, and then I had a slide about
okay, go
our
ahead.
specific, okay, so we had a meeting and we talked about a couple different options. So there's really, between sitting down and all the discussions we've had, the different items that have been brought to our attention, two different options really rose to the top from the meeting, and I kept them very vague on purpose because we really wanted to just see, our question for you today is whether you want us to move forward with one or both of these options, because both of them we could move forward with independent of each other. The first is to update our existing ordinance so that property owners have a path to getting a public hearing set for consideration of a new transient rental overlay district. If we did that, we would write it so it would include a specific set of parameters, and that is likely to be a proposed district boundary, some percentage of signatures within that boundary. What is unclear to me, because I've talked to a number of you independently, is, how big or how many is reasonable, what size is that, or should we just put it on the app, on the property owners for them to make the case? They submit the boundary and they make a case and they have X percentage of signatures, and that is the parameters they fulfill and they'll get a public hearing set. That's option one. Option two, it seems like there's some interest to allow a capped number of transient rentals outside of our overlay districts, which would be a different mechanism. It would be in addition to our existing transient rental overlay process. We have that, it's in place, it's established. This would be an otherwise defined boundary. It could be citywide, it could be our opportunity zone that is a federally designated boundary, that is a place that Sandusky created to say we want investment within this federally designated boundary. That was, one of the conversations we had was like, well, what if we have a hospitality overlay, and that's basically the opportunity zone will allow X number of transient rental permits within this area that's walkable to downtown. And it exists with it also that the transient rental overlay legislation exists.
So my question is, hearing those two alternatives, if you moved forward with the second one, a cap number, as I read this, outside the overlay districts, you're saying the existing overlay districts, if it's a cap number, there's no more overlay districts. People don't come forward and apply for an area. They're just applying for themselves up to a certain cap number.
The conversation that we had would be that our existing legislation would remain in place. So we have a transient rental overlay, we have one existing, we have a path that planning commissioners or city commissioners can move forward to create new districts, new district boundaries. So you all would still have the authority to create more transient rental overlay districts. So that would remain in place. If we go with just option two only, that existing would remain in place. What we would be creating is a new mechanism for allowing piecemeal, just a certain number of.
One house at a time up to.
One application at a time up to a specific capped number of permits. And that will, I think that the idea is that helps us not have to discuss a new overlay district every time someone is interested in a property, but it also allows to set a metric of here's how many we think the city can reasonably withstand without affecting affordable housing or long-term rental housing supply, et cetera. And we don't necessarily have to dictate exactly where they go or discuss the transient rental overlay district every time. And again, we could do both of these at the same time. So we could pursue amending our existing ordinance so people can get a public hearing if they think a district is the best option in their neighborhood or in a specific area, and also do both. So that's really what we wanted to bring.
So if you did both at the same time, which I understand is, I follow what you're saying, then if, let's say you were at the cap number, another person could still come along and say, well, now I've got these 2 square blocks and 50% of the people in there, so then we could come up with another transient overlay. My playing devil's advocate, my only thought about a cap is if it's pick 1,000, if it's 1,000 new houses or 500, whatever you want to pick, 499 gets it and 501 doesn't. And it just seems kind of arbitrarily unfair. So I don't know what the answer is, but.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to tell some folks no. It's just deciding what's good for the city. This is an economic opportunity. It's something that we know there's a lot of demand for.
My devil's argument is, if it's good for 499, why isn't it good for 501?
Then, I mean, you
Yeah.
could extend the cap, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm not in charge. I'm calling on Mr. Miller.
okay, Mr. Zula.
Thank you,
No
Mr.
comment,
Chairman.
Mr. Hill. Yeah, I think that Aaron just said what I'd like to add to that discussion is that a cap is inherently arbitrary, but it isn't the be-all, end-all carved in stone. It's in my view, a conservative way to dip your foot in the water. We set the cap low initially, recognizing that if we get to that cap and there aren't problems, we could determine that, yeah, that cap could be expanded, possibly significantly, because we don't have parking problems. We don't have rowdy parties that the police are responding to all the time. That, yeah, this market really is kind of controlled by the economic mechanism of Airbnb or whatever, that it really is infusing cash and sprucing up neighborhoods, and we got our first 50 or 100 and nobody has any problems with it. Well, the first 100 worked good, let's try a second 100 and see where it goes, till we find a threshold of what the market can handle, what
Mr. Chairman.
neighborhoods can handle.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Zuloff.
So if I understand option 2 correctly, this wouldn't keep us from adding districts. It would, because I couldn't hear everything you said. It would simply provide a separate, right, okay. I like both of these are good ideas, in my opinion. And I think having a pathway, especially that requires, if an applicant does the legwork and presents a petition, that keeps kind of puts a little bit of a hurdle that keeps us from having to entertain a district every time somebody gets a wild idea. So provided, so having a pathway, provided it has a doable process, is fine. Having, I'm not sure you want 1,000 or something. Huron has a number. Somebody knows what the Huron number is.
It's 165.
65, right?
That's
So-
their threshold?
That's their cap.
And they don't have districts. It's like, they've said 165. And I think we have to be careful about the term arbitrary, because everything's arbitrary. Framing everything you don't like as arbitrary is tricky, because, you can say, well, officer, that 35-mile-an-hour speed limit is arbitrary, It is, but is it rational? Does it have a rational basis is more important. So I don't know how they came up with it, if it's some percent, some arbitrary percent, I don't know. But presumably they had some reason for coming up with that number, and I think that's enough to defend against arbitrary, because I don't think there's anything you couldn't argue to be arbitrary. So not to dismiss the chairman's concern about being arbitrary, because we don't want to do that. I think either one works. I don't think we should do both.
On this, I would say the one thing that we should probably, that I think we should keep them separate. I mean, they're two clearly separate things. The one is what I brought up at the last meeting, providing a path forward. Two came up in our meeting as a separate overlay. And I think there's a lot more to kind of figure out with two than there is one. One's just providing a path. Two is we need to figure out a cap, where we're going to start, and then what kind of boundary. When we had this discussion a couple weeks ago, whenever it was, we talked about the opportunity zone. So Monroe Street North from Meigs to Kent Street. And that, I'm not necessarily all over that idea myself. I worry about getting too big or too spread out too fast, somewhat. But I think that everybody here agrees that there's room for more. It's a good idea to have more, and we need to figure out a way to make it happen.
So question, on the second alternative with the cap, the thought or the proposal or the concept is not anywhere in the city. It's within certain areas and it's going to be capped.
I'm open to however you all would want to regulate that. The conversation that we had did center around the opportunity zone because it is a designated boundary. You know, the city stated we think investment should happen here. So that's a logical boundary that's already in place. And often when you're doing things like this, if you tack on to a story you've already told or an idea you've already had, it gives it a little bit more strength. I'm open to, just from a planning perspective, I'm open to other options. Like I thought about, what about just two-family zoning? We have a lot of two-family zoning. It's generally pretty walkable. It's generally concentrated in the most historic spot in the city. What if it's just the two-family zoning district? I think that it's in the established residential like R175 and R160, R140, where we would get a lot of residents that don't want to see these. I don't know. I don't think that if they slowly proliferated, even citywide, and we didn't get slammed with a gazillion of them at once, I don't think it's going to be hugely detrimental to the city of Sandusky. I've read some studies about how, you know, they do have rent increase. They're like, for every 1% increase in Airbnb, there's like a 0.08 rent increase from one study that I was looking at. So it's not, people aren't seeing like huge swings. We do have 4,666 registered rental properties in the city, and we have about 11,000 households, just for context. So almost half of our city is currently long-term rental. If we saw, you know, if we allowed.
What was the other number again? You said 11,000 households.
It's just over 11,000 households and just over 460 registered rental properties.
4,000?
4,600 registered rentals, long-term rentals. So if we saw a huge percent, if we saw 20% of those turn over to short-term rentals, then all of a sudden, that's a lot of housing we're losing for long-term renters. If we see 5%, I don't know that that's a giant loss, because we're going to see so much investment in properties that we have a lot of architecture that has suffered disinvestment for 20, 30 years. And it's really spread out. It's down, you know, if you start looking like, well, the opportunity zone makes sense because it's walkable to downtown, because we're a destination city. Well, what about like right along the other side of Monroe? It's right over, you hang right on Monroe, you go to Cedar Point. You know, like it's like you could almost argue for any boundary, which is the trouble with opening up this. I think was Commissioner Whalen was making that point, is that there's a lot to figure out if we go with option 2.
I still have questions about your numbers. The rentals is based on registered
Yes.
Which may be undercounted. And
It's-
the households has been based on what, the census?
Census, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the rentals are almost certainly undercounted. I do think we have pretty good compliance with that, but I'm certain that there's other rentals that exist.
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, in the Huron situation, so whatever their cap is, 165 or whatever, is that anywhere in the city? I mean, like, could Beechwood Cove, you could rent your house there?
It's in any residential district.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
On further deliberation, I realized that this really, the cap sounds good, but you could, if you keep the existing ordinance and have a cap outside the overlay districts, you could still theoretically wind up with, 100% transient rentals. I think there's a pretty good case to be made for capping arbitrarily or not, or something reasonable and rational, capping the overall number of transient rentals, whether they be via option 2 or option 1. I think we really have a very good ordinance as it was written. It creates some hurdles, doesn't allow willy-nilly to transient rentals. It creates some good standards and creates a clear purpose for doing it. And it's worked well so far, with the exception of some folks don't like that it's not real easy to get it done, but that was probably the intent. I'm not against making it easier, but I would be against not having some reasonable cap, which, as Mr. Miller pointed out, could always be revisited later if it turns out to be inadvisable. But a conservative cap on all transient rentals seems only prudent. It's reversible, it's amendable, but at least let's set a standard and err on the side of caution.
Go ahead, Ms. Blair.
Two things. Quick analysis, I got 5.5% of total households is Huron's current cap, so 165 capped. I Googled it.
Yeah, so it might have been based on 5% or something like that.
Yeah, so it might have been. Another thing is that I have, based on the last conversation, I have had last planning commission with discussion of people being able to get on the agenda. I have 2 folks that have submitted signatures and a potential boundary. I have those on a slide I'd like to show you tonight, just in case any of you want to make a motion to move those forward to set a public hearing. And I just want to let you know that they're in this slide deck for after this conversation, just so you know.
Mr. Miller.
Just a point of curiosity, of the 165 permissible in Huron, how many are there?
When I spoke to the zoning director, I believe he told me it was like 127 or 135, so they were close already, but not full.
Over what period of time?
I think it was like a year. This is pretty new, but he was new to his position, so he didn't know how they came up with that number. And this was when I was doing research in like September. So it's
And that's 5.5% of their households?
total households, just based on a very quick analysis right
Right, okay.
this chair.
I have a thought. I don't know the requirements totally, but it's my feeling that the requirement, even if let's say you're in an overlay district already, the requirement to be able to do the transient rental is not insignificant.
No.
So you have to gonna jump through some hurdles, and I might question it this way: is it reasonable to think that some long-term rental, the properties, even if they were in good shape, because of the size of the lots, like off-street parking is required, is that correct?
There's off-street parking, there's a fire inspection, an internal inspection.
So it's possible that some long-term rentals might not even be able to qualify for transient rental, even if they were in an appropriate district, theoretically.
That's a reasonable assumption, I would think.
I don't know, if you're gonna pursue this for the city, I think with a cap, and you, Mr. Miller said you could pick a small cap, but I think it's reasonable to do both. And if somebody wants to pick a geographical area and make an application and has a certain number of homeowners within that property, or area, I should say, boundary, and then if somebody else doesn't want to go through all that and just wants to do one up to a certain cap, I don't see a reason not to have both.
You're saying the cap would dictate?
No, I'm saying but do both alternatives.
Yes.
In other words, if somebody really says, boy, there's a particular area here that would be just great for a whole new overlay district, that's one alternative. And again, you have the procedure how to go through it, and you have to get enough people, and you're gonna have a hearing, and they have to convince everybody. Or if just one person says, I'd like to do it for my home, with, like, apparently in Huron, that's the way they can do it, up to a certain cap, and they may get to 165 and say, we're gonna move it to 200.
Yeah, our 5.5% would be 600, give or take, a nice round number. The more I look at number two, the more I think about it, I think it's inadvisable to say outside the overlay district and simply place a cap overall. In addition, so to me, what would work really well is amend the ordinance to provide a pathway and also allow a pathway for individual sites, but at the same time, cap the overall number, whether it be district or individuals, at, say, 600. And that's a big number. Probably be a while before we get there, but at least have some throttle on it.
For clarity, when you say cap the overall number, you mean of residential zoned homes that are allowed VRBO, correct? Not total.
Yes, of course, yeah.
I
Right.
figured, but I didn't want to say.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're worried about, well, maybe, I think it's a fair question. I was thinking the residential properties, but what else is, it becomes a residence. Just because it's in a commercial zone, it's still a residential unit. If you can rent it as a residential unit, even if it's transient. So to answer your question, maybe not. Maybe just simply, I think we all have to give it some more thought, but are we even, talking about outside? These will all be counted. We'll know where they are, right? Whether even if they're in a commercial district, we will know how many we have. Maybe we need to give that some thought.
The problem of restricting it, a number beyond just residential would be, then what is somebody who's zoned appropriate allowed to do it after you reach the number?
Well, right.
And they're not allowed to use their zoning for what it's zoned.
Well, that's a question that has to be answered. On the other hand, and if someone has a commercial site, say someplace off of First Street, and they build a tower with 600 units in it, and they're all,
It's happening in Traverse City.
What's that?
It's happening in Traverse City. People
Yeah.
are building like 70-unit apartment buildings just for transient rental.
You're going to see office towers in cities converted to residential, and they, may become transient too, so.
The opportunity zone, what are the boundaries of that?
It's generally Monroe Street, Camp Street, I believe, on the west. Is that right? And then Meg's on the, so it's like roughly like Monroe to the water, but the west is like it's over by like Camp and Tiffin and all that.
And if I'm following correctly, the cap would only apply to the second alternative? The overlay, the cap doesn't apply to that?
There is no
because
current
Yeah.
cap on the overlay
Yeah.
district. The way that we wrote the option was that the cap number would be for units outside the overlay district.
Right.
And then what I've noted that Mr. Zuloff was mentioning is he thinks maybe a total cap of permits would be reasonable
For both?
for all, like just
I
a
think-
total cap on
Okay.
permits.
Yeah,
I do
'cause I
think that
would-
Mr. Whalen brings up a good legal
Yeah.
point, that if you're zoned in a district, a commercial district that would allow that use legally, I'm not sure we can cap those.
Yeah, I was going
Or
to say
or
that,
or already a previously approved transit overlay district.
Right.
and is the cap then truly a cap? Because if you can, if the overlay district already has some and you can do as many as you want because it's approved, then
That was
it's
my
only a
point.
cap in this area.
My point is that the
Yeah.
cap should include, be larger, but include the overlays, not be separate from the overlay.
Yeah, but I guess I'm inclined to say there should be a cap. And I'm wondering, is there any, you hear about all the benefits of Airbnb and the economic impact and all that. Is there any literature that talks about maybe a downside to it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of balance angles out there. What's interesting is a lot of the studies, and you'll find this in, I think, any topic you want to throw
Sure.
out in the world, but a lot of the studies for it are funded by VRBO, Airbnb, folks that work in that industry. And then a lot of the downside, people that are complaining about it are like, my neighbor does this and they have parties and I hate it. So it's interesting. You can definitely spend hours and hours and hours reading about this. I did include some links. I tried to find what seemed to be generally third-party sources that talked about the pros and cons in the brief that I sent out. So there's some sources there. And I think that, there's a big summary in that document that I prepared, and largely it's, yes, you bring in economic benefit. Yes, you see a lot of investment in properties. Yes, there will be there's a decrease in long-term rentals. It's what point does that become an affordability issue is a big question, and I believe we're far from that point in Sandusky. Our rents are pretty low, and a lot of places our property values are very low compared to our peers in Huron-Vermilion, Catawba, Marblehead. I mean, in this region, the city of Sandusky has been undervalued for a long time, and we're just now seeing this kind of spark of interest because of the great work that the business community and the government has been doing over the last 10 years. We're seeing this interest in the city now.
Two quick comments. We're all talking caps. I'm definitely in agreement that a cap is important. I would see it more as on the lower end to start based on just residentially zoned properties. So that would include all overlay districts, I would assume. If you put a cap on the number of places that are zoned residential that can do this, I would rather see it go on the low end. The one negative side that I worry about, I love Sandusky because of how affordable it is, right? I think that a lot of people live here because of that reason. And if you allow for an explosion, I think that we can get it very high here in town as far as percentage of property values and costs going up.
Equally important is the loss of full-time resident, census households. For every rental unit that gets converted to transient, you've lost 3.2 residents, or whatever the average number is. I don't even know. What would you guess our number?
Our
We have-
household size is like 2.7 or 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Point
And
It's got to be
that's
2
something.
point something, because, 11,000 into 25,000.
That one's an interesting one that I haven't seen a lot of articles or studies about, because there's some intuition that would occur, that if you increase transient rental, then you're decreasing population. But I also think that it's likely that if we increase the amount of visitors that can frequent the places here, we have that economic vitality, meaning businesses don't have to close, that Sandusky is a place that people want to be, and the more Sandusky is a place people want to be, more people will want to live here. So I actually think it could help increase our population, which is counterintuitive.
Okay, but there's
I don't
also-
have specific evidence to support that. It's just,
At the same time, there's also a counterintuitive that there is evidence to support, and that is that prosperity lowers population density in places like this. A lot of people live here because it's affordable, but they also move to their dream house in Perkins as soon as they can afford to. So don't be fooled into thinking prosperity is going to keep people, it's going to lower your density. You have children and parents living with the homeowner that out of economic necessity or expediency, and then when things get good, the kids can afford their own place, the parents don't. So that's the counterintuitive one that's well documented, that you lose density with prosperity in older housing stocks, for sure.
You can argue that if somebody wants to live in the downtown area in a small lot, but 10 of the houses on the same block are slums, they're not going to stay there. And if they're all fixed up, even if they're people coming in and out Airbnb. So I don't know. I just think money raises everybody. And I think everybody's here is in agreement to try to figure out some way to do this. It's just a question, do you do one? Do you do both of them? What's the cap? It's here. I'm curious of the overlay district, where you can do it right now by just meeting the conditions. Do we have, of the totality of the places, do we have any percentage of how many have done it already? Like in the Cove District?
I don't have a count on percentages of total households in that overlay, because we'd have to hand count that. When I did the research, I produced a map for you. I'm trying to recall. It wasn't nearly as many as I thought. It was like a dozen over there or something like that. At least that I found, there's like a third party, it's like B&B data or something that pulls data for you. And there's a screenshot of that in that packet that I created for you to show how many. It's not like half the, it's much fewer than I thought.
Personally, I think it's going to be, the first wave is going to be underused buildings that are being fixed up. I don't think we're going to be taking quality housing and turning it into, that's my personal thought. So I think it would be a while before it would be a real negative problem. But just my thought.
I think most of it's going to be energetic people who just see an opportunity, and it's going to have a lot to do with the people more than the property.
Well, they got to have property, they got to pick a property to do it in.
Well, sure, but keep in mind that a lot of this is small enterprising people doing it on their own, not large operations. And if that's true, then they're likely to be thinking about proximity and convenience. I mean, if you got to make a bed every morning, you don't want to be driving all over. On the other hand, the applicant that dropped their application today, that seems to be an enterprise that does multiple properties. So I think it's developing as a business model as well. And what we have to keep in mind too is that the distinction is going to blur between, say, suite hotels and transient rental. I mean, suite hotel is transient rental, right? What's the difference between a condo full of suites and a suite hotel when you allow transient rental? What you have is a whole different community, and that was the debate that we had with the Chesapeake. A lot of local residents bought those as retirement homes or investments for long-term rentals, and were distressed when it was determined that it was allowed to rent them, by the weekend, and it created a somewhat different community within that 200-unit facility than was expected.
Just to counter that, some of those people that even if they weren't renting it out short-term, they're coming off and on themselves.
Well, I wasn't judging it. I was just saying that's what happened.
Yeah. So it's not the same as a neighborhood. I mean, there's different people. Even if the owners don't do an Airbnb, they don't always come. Their kids come. Their cousins come. It doesn't have to be a rental. It's not a retirement community where they're all living there day in and day out. So it was a vacation condo unit from the get-go. So
Well, that's not what many buyers I know were expecting. I can tell you that just from personal discussions.
Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Miller.
I like that we had a meeting, that we have time to engage in some of this discussion. I think eventually it has to get closed up a little bit. And so in some sense, I'm a little reluctant to throw this bomb in, but I think we've already touched it a few times that while in the past, it may have been enterprising local people who saw an opportunity to rent space or to buy a flipper house or a house that they would have flipped, but now they can rent it out. And then the trend that we saw, and I think maybe Mike just referenced this, on First Street where an entity from Colorado is buying a bunch of houses. And what I envisioned here, not that the application said all this, but I intuited that when Mr. Waldock sold those properties, that I understood, maybe incorrectly, when it was Bar Rubber down there or something, that these were factory houses across the road, the little places where employees of the factory worked just across the road. They can walk home for lunch or whatever. These houses are now in demand, and it takes me to a report I saw on 60 Minutes over the weekend that in many communities, like in the southeast where my niece just tried to buy a house, and every house that came up was going as much as 20 or 30 or 40 or 50,000 over the asking price for all these, that a huge percentage of houses in certain markets are being bought up by commercial interests. Big banks are buying these things, and I wonder about this Colorado corporation that's buying up these little houses, that they're the ability to do what Cedar Point has done with all their little chalets and all their little cottages out there. Yeah, that's what I think is happening, and we have a mechanism to do that. Houses are going to get bought for more money than they would have been bought for otherwise. They will put money into them, and it'll, as I think you were alluding, Mr. Chairman, tend to raise everybody a little bit. There might be people that can no longer afford to live in the inner city like I feel like I can't. I would love to live downtown, but it's priced beyond me. And then my wife says, well, yeah, but think about it. We're on 48th Street. We practically live downtown. We can ride a bicycle down there. It's like, yeah, it's maybe pushing people out a little bit, but the center of our town is a jewel, and I think we should respect it for that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Bajaj.
In my travels over the years, whenever I would be over in here and for a meeting or something, and we would talk about housing and those types of issues, the hierarchy would always complain about, or they would always say, Huron's becoming a bedroom community. We do not want Huron to become a bedroom community. We want full-time residents, and we also, it's a tax on our safety services and other things that don't pay people that don't pay taxes that live here permanently. And I'm just throwing that out. But I guess where I'm going now is.
Wait, doesn't bedroom community imply that they live there, but they work in Cleveland? They drive home to.
No, I think they were talking more about people that only live there part-time, only live there half the year, or would rent their properties out. But I guess we've kind of beat the pros and cons to death about this over the last couple of meetings. I mean, I've only been here for 3. But I guess where I'm going is, what is our next step? I think we have to make a decision. We have to decide how we're going to do this. And maybe we can put a provision in there that on a yearly basis, it's reviewed. If we set a cap, say for 100 units, we come back and see how it's working. Every year we review this, and if we need to amend things, we amend it at that time. But unless we decide and go in a certain direction, I guess we could we could contemplate this forever. We could debate it forever.
Well, I think we can move toward a consensus of moving forward with option one, coming up with criteria for proposals, as was Mr. Whalen's concern, and that we also could move to a consensus that we should have a cap of overall, not outside the district, but we should have a cap, which is easy to fix if it's a problem. But I think we can get a consensus on that.
Does that include some type of a public hearing or a couple of public hearings to find out what the community might think? I don't know.
On a particular single application? Is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know. Do we really know how the community, do we know how the community feels about this?
Well, legislation requires hearings anyway.
Public hearing, yeah.
So it's the planning commission's authority to amend the zoning code. You do not have to have a public hearing.
No, we can. They have to.
You may hold a public hearing. When we get an application that a property owner is pursuing, we must send out a notification to surrounding properties and have a public hearing. If you give us direction to move both of these items forward, we would draft much more, get you a more solid draft to continue the debate. I would imagine it would take more than one meeting to do that and to come up with a final recommendation. And it would also go to city commission.
Well, let's not conflate neighbor notice with public hearing. If we're proposing legislation, zoning legislation, planning and zoning legislation, then it's the purview of this body to hold a public hearing or not. In any event, it goes to the planning or the city commission, and the city commission must hold well, okay, the city has to do it if, in the past, sometimes the city has not done a public hearing, if we already had a public hearing, but I'm pretty sure that they have to do one anyway.
I can't speak to what the city's done in the past, but.
I'm going ancient history.
But upon receiving the recommendation of the planning commission, the city commission is supposed to set a public hearing.
Yes.
Which normally coincides with the date that they also consider said legislation.
Right, and us having had a public hearing does not relieve them of the duty to have a public hearing.
That is my understanding, correct?
So just two observations. If you go with the cap procedure, if that gets approved, it's my understanding that an individual resident owner makes an application and has to comply with the requirements, off-street parking and inspection by the fire department. But at that point, their neighbors don't have anything to say about it. Either they complete the requirements and they get approved, or they don't. I'm just pointing that out. I'm not saying yes or no to the process.
That doesn't have to be true. I mean, there could be two things. Either you could just simply open it up first come, first serve, or you could still have a cap but still require approval. So that's two different frameworks.
Well, that's not what I'm reading in that proposal for number two.
Well, it doesn't say either way.
So you're saying we would approve them one by one at this?
Well, I'm not. It doesn't say either way.
The way it was presented to me was we were just going to open up like 100 and first come, first serve, and as long as you applied, made the application.
Well, that would be one option, but it's not what this says. It's silent on that.
Well, let me finish. Let me finish my other observation.
Okay, right.
Okay, my other observation is that this really, as I recollect, started with the Cove District. And it was a group of people who took regular residential homes, some of which were in bad shape, and fixed them up and decided they wanted to do this. And they presented the concept to the city, formally, informally, I don't know however it got done, and it's worked out great. And from what I've seen on a couple of occasions so far, people on the edges of it, but not included in it, have moved to expand it. So now we've moved it a little bit over Meg Street into Washington Street, and a little bit, I think it's gone a little bit across First Street now, a couple houses on the other side. And so, and I'm not aware that there's been any huge negative feedback from anybody within the Cove District since it's happened. So I'm just I'm not trying to argue pro or con, I'm just saying that so far, and yes, we have commercial buildings that have some upstairs and maybe lend themselves to doing that, but these were just regular residences, and so far, it's been so good. That's my second observation, but again, I will go back to that first one. If you're gonna let individuals apply anywhere in the city, in true residential neighborhoods, you're liable to have some neighbors saying, whoa, what's going on here to my neighbor's house? So, just a thought.
At minimum, can we just say, let's move forward with one?
At the very least, I'd like to see that happen, and I'd say come up with a written proposal that says the applicant sets the initial boundary. I mean, I think it's got to be bigger than one house, and if it's a 1 square block area, or a 10 square block area, and then the way it's been proposed by Mr. Whalen, I think a certain percentage of homeowners in that area would sign a petition in favor of it, and if they get enough, whatever the minimum percentage is, then we have a hearing on it, and everybody within that area gets to come and say yes or no, and then we vote on it, and then that becomes another transient overlay district. At the very least, I would suggest we move forward with that.
As a follow-up to that, when we had the discussion, we did the 40 and 25, 40 parcels, 25%. I was just throwing something.
I know
We
that.
had to have a starting spot. The two that
Right.
were before us and that have been around for a while were 45 and 47.
Yeah.
25% seemed good. We had discussed that perhaps, because I think you're right, there's lots of areas where maybe 8, maybe 12 is big enough, but then you need a higher percentage.
Yeah.
A peak,
And-
right?
and
I mean, if
then-
you're gonna do it for a 5 block.
And then the application just gets it to the hearing stage.
Right.
And we hear everything and we can say yes or no. And if we say yes, I think it becomes then another transient overlay district.
There's a lot of contingencies that worry me with two.
Right.
I'll say that.
So what if we moved forward with this, but just to cover our bases, and I know there are some concerns outside of this body that have to approve this, you could throw in, let's forget about the onesies for a moment. Let's create a pathway, but let's also go ahead and put a cap.
Yeah, I agree with that as well.
Okay, so we're getting somewhere. So it's not immutable. I mean, you know, you can change the cap, but let's cover, I don't know, you want to make a motion?
Does that include a boundary?
Well, a motion to
Just
ask the staff to move
all right.
forward on the details of not the onesies, but a pathway and a cap.
So my understanding, you're saying just a cap on the overlay districts? You're not saying anything outside of an overlay district?
Kind of like we discussed.
Right.
And if we,
So-
I know what you're saying.
Yeah, a cap on all residential,
An overall
Ju-
cap?
just-
Applications, I think.
so not option 2, a cap on option 1, and add a cap to the number of total units that we will allow in overlay districts.
So that's
Residential
further
zones.
constraining the existing legislation, not expanding.
That's correct. So Mr. Whalen seems to agree that we're going to make it easier to get it, but we're going to put limits on it.
You know, just to counter that, I mean, I think you can control the absolute number, because these new overlay districts are gonna come before us with a hearing. And if things get out of control, I think we can say no. I'm concerned by putting an absolute cap with, as Mr. Whalen had said, about some of these that are in commercial districts already with the zoning, with whether it's already
Well, I
approved.
think the cap would be on residentially zoned
Right.
properties being used as
Okay.
VRBOs total, whether they're in a existing overlay district or new. And I don't know, I mean, I'm thinking lower number, like 300-ish, maybe 400-ish. But I do think that that's important, because then how do you say no to
So-
that next set? If we get a
Right.
batch of 5 come up in 5 months from now, and we're like, whoa, this is growing way faster than we thought,
I think
right? If you have a cap, then you're protected.
the chairman's concern is valid. I think, I can see why you don't like the cap, but we're going to have public hearings, and a lot of people might feel better about the cap, and the legislators might feel better about the cap. And we know that it's not that big of a deal anyway, so,
I think we're gonna have to figure out if it's, I guess, legal to limit transient overlay districts that already exist, where every house in there has already been.
no, that's what we're talking about at all.
The limit would be far
We're talking
bigger than the number of
about if you add up
properties
all the houses in all the transient districts, it can only be three, we only have, I don't know how many we have in the
there.
district.
I'd guess 80 to 100
We got
in
80.
there now.
So Mr. Whalen is saying, let's limit the number of houses we have in these districts just to,
Total number,
So
right?
total number, so you're not talking limit capping.
Within the district.
Permits, you're talking capping houses that exist within a
Right.
district?
Yeah.
yeah. If so let's say the
No, I was
numbers,
thinking permits,
I
actually.
was, yeah, that's.
yeah. Oh,
Well,
well,
she's saying when we get to a total of 400 houses
Approved,
inside
you're
of
saying
an
approved,
overlay.
you're saying approved permits.
Right.
In other words, if they don't get approved,
Yeah.
it doesn't make it, you could have 1,000 applications, but if only 50 of them get approved, you've only got 50.
Well, you gotta be in an overlay district to be able to apply.
Yeah.
So
Well,
as
I
long
think-
as we're not too far over, if you got 600 houses
Yeah.
in overlay districts and we only allow 400, we'll probably still be all right.
well, I don't think you want to tell somebody in a district that sorry, we're out of, we've exceeded the number. I think what we need to do is the cap needs to be on the number of houses in any districts altogether. So let's say we already have 80, what do we have? 80 houses in districts
That's a
right now.
good guess.
Uh,
I haven't counted them.
Okay, we need that number, but it's not that hard to find. So what we could say is, look, we don't want the whole city to be a bunch of districts, so we could say 300 or 400 houses. So once we have 300 and somebody wants to add 120, you say, nope, it's too many, our cap's 400, and keep a throttle on it. And if we want to change it, we can. But at this point, let's not open the gates to allow the whole city to become a district.
My suggestion would be is if you have a cap that apply to new overlay districts that are approved.
Sure, it would be the same difference, a different number, yeah, sure.
Take away 80 from the total or add 80 to the total if 80.
Okay. You getting all
80 is
this?
how much
So
we're at.
my point is that if in the, whatever new overlay districts that are approved, and if you reach the cap and don't extend the cap, I'm still saying that I think it's appropriate that previously approved overlay districts, which before allowed everybody in there to make the application, and if they qualify, that they should still have a shot at it. They shouldn't be limited by
Oh.
the cap.
Right, you're missing something. What we're talking about is capping the number of houses, not approved units, in all districts. So in other words, if we have 80 houses in that district, that would count toward the cap, right? So if all approved districts, 100% of those houses could be transients in every approved district. We would just have to stop approving districts once we hit the cap of the number of approvable.
So once you're in, you're in.
Yeah,
Because we
once
won't
you're in the
approve
district, you're in.
Above the limit.
Oh, I
So
got you.
does that, I think that satisfies your concern.
Okay.
So you're saying houses versus units?
I'm sorry?
It's number of houses versus units
I think
goes
units is
against the
actually-
cap?
Hit the mute.
The number of houses versus the number of units goes against the cap. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the number of, a unit is a house, so
Well, but if you had a 80-unit house and you're saying the house, so does that count as one or does that count as 80 units?
Right.
80,
Well, that's an interesting problem that
Three
I
is the max
think
you
we
can
could.
have in a
That's something
residential
that you would have to
Jump in and
think
say,
of.
just from an administrative perspective, the number of total permits would be much easier to track and keep
Yeah,
count
I
of
would say
than the
permits.
number of structures,
Right.
units, buildings, houses, or whatever within a line.
But
Like,
do you
there's-
understand their concern? And I think it's legitimate that you don't want somebody who's in a district that's allowed to then all of a sudden be
Right.
out because
That's
they've
the
exceeded
why
the
I
number of limits.
specifically phrased it to be a cap outside the overlay districts to avoid that.
But that brings in the concern of what about new construction within a district? Right? So you think
It's
you
still
only
maxed at three,
Hey.
it's still maxed at three if it's in zoned residential, right?
Yeah, right. Well, anyway, I think you probably have enough to work on.
I have a lot of notes, and if you would like to move forward with both of these and figure out the nuances of them, a cap, meaning, like, scrub what's on the slide, moving forward with a way that people can get on, get a public hearing set, and some sort of cap, however that ends up being phrased, is what, I'm hearing general consensus on
We need to
both of those big ideas.
We need a conservative cap.
Hearing
Yes.
that you'd like further work on one, do you want me to talk with her? You want her to come up with a proposal? Further work on one with a cap, is everybody semi
I think
in
that's the
favor
start.
of that?
I
Would
think
like to
that's
see
the
a
starting
specific
point.
proposal
I think
on
that's the
that to
starting
go
point.
from
I think
there.
that's the starting point. And then do we want to consider, well, once you get that nailed down, do you even want to consider individual applications?
That worries me about a total
I
city.
agree.
Yeah.
I mean, don't we have people suing each other right now in certain residential neighborhoods?
Yes.
So then all of a sudden, then that's allowed? If it's citywide,
We would, if
long as
that,
you meet
if
the
we continue to
requirements.
pursue that, we will cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah, if we don't want to entertain individual units, then capping the units outside the district is meaningless because there won't be any outside the district, so,
That is, I'm understanding that.
yeah.
Let's start with the new overlay district, whatever the size of it is, with a path forward to consider that, and then go from there.
Okay, that makes sense. Permission to show you those last slides that I've got in here?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So I've been contacted with, by Mr. Andrew Mulry, who lives at 302 East Washington Street. He's proposing a new transient rental overlay district just along the properties facing Washington Street that are across from the expected food hall project and the block that's downtown business directly across. So in yellow, you can see I have outlined the exact parcel lines. In red is the map that Mr. Mulry submitted to me. He has submitted a petition with signatures from 9 homes out of the 10, I'm sorry, 7 signatures out of the 9 existing homes. So he's submitted 70% support for an overlay district here. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention. If any of you would like to make a motion to set a public hearing to discuss this potential overlay district. My understanding is Mr. Mulry, from what he told me, he currently lives in that home. He loves being close to Sandusky, but his family is growing a little larger than that home can support. So he's finding a bigger home, but he would like to maintain that one and be able to come stay at it to take his kids to downtown events. And if he gets a long-term renter in there, then he won't be able to stay there. So he'd like to do an Airbnb so he can have other people stay there, but then he can still stay there with his family when he wants to. And like I said, it's bound by Hancock Street in Franklin, so it's that single block. It's across the street from existing downtown business zoning, and he has 70% support from his neighbors to bring this forward to you.
I have a question. I may be on the wrong block, but is that kind of royal blue big house next to Untitled, is that on East Washington? And that's going to be short-term rental?
That is on East Washington. It is one block over on the, no, it is on It's across the street from this. So it's in the,
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Franklin and East Washington.
yeah, so
Right
like,
on the corner?
right, right on the corner.
So it's in the same block and across the street?
Correct.
Right on the very end?
Right on the
So-
corner.
So my point in bringing that up is that's already been approved for that.
Correct,
I mean,
because it's zoned downtown business.
That's zoned different.
Yeah,
What-
It's not approved as a VRBO, it's in the zoning that allows VRBO.
That's correct.
yes.
Why is that zone, why would, I'm
Because
just,
it's on the other side of Washington.
oh, so
Everything north of Washington.
is zoned what?
It's downtown business, so it's the teal. So
Okay.
that block contains the drive-through and the expected food hall, the Washington, which you're
Okay.
mentioning, which is the 8-unit new Airbnb. It contains the 3-story, 8-unit really square building that's currently long-term rental. And then where the distillery is being built, it's that block that's right across the street from these.
So normally, we would probably be loath to, on a residential street, you'd be loath to create a district that was on one side of the street, not on the other. But in this particular case, it fits perfectly because the north side is downtown business. So it seems like a rational, reasonable proposal.
Mr. Chairman?
You have of these?
I have two.
You have two more?
No, I have one additional to this one.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with Mr. Zuloff. You already have that use across the street, and I think this would just be a similar use.
Subject, of course, to the process.
Yes.
So would someone care to make that in the form of a motion? I think procedurally, what we're talking about,
It would be a motion to set a public hearing for
Right, that's what-
possibly the next planning commission meeting to discuss a proposed transient rental overlay district at this location.
and that would, with the defined areas, and everybody would be notified, and it would
Correct.
be a hearing. So
Correct.
that's the issue for the present, if there's to be a present motion.
Who wants to jump on that motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion on that motion? Maybe call the roll?
Mr. McGorry?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Bajali?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
That motion has passed, so I guess we'll proceed with a public hearing and notice to all the affected individuals.
We will, thank you.
See how it works.
One more slide.
The second one that I received this morning is from Mr. James Maldonado, and you've seen him before. He's come forward and been part of this whole conversation. So he's proposing a transient rental overlay district on West Monroe Street, bound by Marquette, Tyler, and LaSalle. It's outlined in red on the zoning district, or on the zoning map on the left. The center, that Winnebago Street, goes directly north into Lions Park. So it is directly adjacent to the entry to Lions Park.
Doesn't this overlap a district that we already entertained?
There has been, there was a draft, so this was one of the ones that Mr. Volz brought forward to you as a draft overlay a year and a half ago. And then when I first started, that had been tabled, and you asked me to do public meetings, that we had a couple public meetings about. There were some resident concerns in this neighborhood. This current, to my recollection of the folks that were concerned, this boundary does not include those, although I did receive one email from a woman that said, hey, my husband just signed a petition, and I'm not sure I support it. So I know there was.
Tell her to get a divorce.
I told her if you make a motion, that it would be a public hearing, and if there's, public support, then you might recommend it. So like, she understands the process, and that if you decide to set a public hearing, that she's invited to come speak.
He gets the vote,
So we
she
had
doesn't.
a back and forth.
Mr.
So
Chairman, this one needs more work. It's got like one side of the street in the district and then across the street not, and
yeah,
I think it needs, I think we got to work on that proposal a little bit before we have a hearing.
so this is the boundary that was submitted to me by Mr. Maldonado. He spoke to about 40 homes and received 15 signatures and 3 he told me that 3 were neutral. He did submit a letter, which I can email to you, I don't have it in front of me. But the boundaries that he was proposing are West Monroe Street at the north, Marquette at the west, Tyler Street the south, the east. It's 54 parcels, there's about 39 existing homes, and he submitted 15 signatures, so that is 27.7% of the total parcels in this boundary.
Okay, and maybe we're illustrating a problem with the proposed legislation change because here we're using streets as the boundaries, and that's really not the best way to do a district, and that's why, the one we just promoted didn't do the block. The boundary was the back of the lots, and had there been residential zone properties, you might have included those too. I think that using streets within a residential district as the boundaries for a TRO is the worst possible way to do it.
I don't understand
If I
that.
may.
Yeah, versus what?
What, you don't understand that one side of the street's going to be rentals, and you're going to be, the neighbors across the street are going to be looking at, if, I'm saying both sides of the street, in most cases, ought to be
Well,
transients.
it's wherever you draw the line, it's either going to be across the street or it's going to be houses in a backyard.
That's correct, and the point being that the character of the street is usually what defines it. In fact, I don't even know how, I think the Cove District, we followed what I'm talking about, at least to some degree.
No, it was the streets. It was Meg Street, and it was Monroe Street.
Well,
Or First Street.
yeah.
To begin with, then it got expanded across the street.
Well, for the exact reason I'm talking about, it makes no sense to, if the character of the street's the same on both sides of the street, why would you zone one way and not the other? I'm saying that the backyards are the better way to, I think I made my point.
This is what was submitted by this applicant, and you're saying it should be bigger.
I'm saying we should explore, no, I'm not saying bigger or smaller, I'm saying we need well, first of all, this doesn't really follow the legislation in the first place. We're kind of doing this, jumping ahead with our new proposed legislation. We don't have to entertain this at all. I mean,
I feel a
we
bit
should.
bound because
We should.
it does meet the requirements I stated at the last meeting.
What's that?
It does meet the requirements I stated at the last meeting, so I personally feel a little bit bound to, follow my word on what I said I would do.
Well, yeah, I'm not against it. I'm saying, though, that we have to consider, I don't think we should automatically say yes or no on the boundaries. I think we need to look at when somebody.
I would agree that I like these boundaries less than the originally posed.
That's, yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And so while I do feel like I, would be not following what I just said at the last meeting that I would do, if I didn't recommend this, I would like to see
Couldn't we have a
lines
hearing?
change. Yes,
and
that was gonna be my
tinker
question.
with the
When
proposal?
we have the hearing, we can still amend it. Correct?
Yes.
We can tell him, hey,
But then you get into
you
notice.
need to
Then you get into notice problems. It would be better to work on the boundaries and then have the hearing so that you don't have to have another hearing because you're changing the boundaries and now you have different notice requirements and different interested parties.
Yeah, but the first notice requirements get more people here that can help contribute to the new
Yeah.
boundaries.
And the notice requirement will have both sides of the street because of the proximity to it. Maybe not the backyard neighbor, but they'll have the other side of the street.
But we're about to
right?
see the problem
I have a
with
question.
allowing everybody
How does the
to.
size of this application compare to the size of the previous one we just approved?
The size itself, it's similar, it's narrower and longer. The other one was broader and more concentrated on Monroe Street.
Maybe how many houses, I'm curious.
I believe the first one was 47 parcels, is that what you counted?
47 or 45.
45, 47 parcels. So this one is a few more parcels. It's narrowed. So the biggest opposition that Mr. Maldonado has heard is from the owner on the corner of Marquette and Monroe on the other side of the street. And so he really wants to protect.
But he gets to be part of the, he
Yeah,
gets public
he-
notice anyways,
Sure,
right?
yeah, yes, he would get
So
public notice
excluding
to
him
this.
from the district doesn't necessarily gain him anything, right? Because he still can come here and express his displeasure.
That is
So,
true. He would be
I
within.
would really,
Agree.
I mean, I am gonna make a motion that we see this hearing, or that I will make a motion that we allow a public hearing. Now it needs a second to pass for that to be meaningful, right? If it doesn't,
I'll second.
he's gotta go back to the drawing board on his design.
I'll
And so maybe we wanna think about that as well.
Did you make a motion?
I did make a
It's
motion.
seconded.
Okay,
Could I suggest that we expand the area of notice beyond the statutory requirement to include, just in case some additional properties get included, so that we're not getting into a problem with notice if the boundaries change?
Well, and the other benefit of that is then we'll get possibly more interested people, right? That's the idea.
Sure.
It should extend
Sure.
further beyond Monroe.
So the current regulation would have us expand 300 feet outside the boundary.
Nothing could stop you from notifying more people.
Right, my question would be, what would your direct, is that 400 feet, is that 500 feet?
All along Monroe.
No,
from
I'd
Superior to
say-
Bennett, at least.
Let's say that we add the houses across the street.
They would be notified, the houses.
They would be
across.
within.
Well, of course they would. The
Oh,
point
that you're
is,
s-
go
so one more
300 feet
block,
from
so it
any.
would be one more, yeah.
Go
So
300
that's
feet from
another-
any positive.
That's another 100 feet then.
Go 300 feet from any plausible addition to this thing.
Which I think should go down Monroe to
Not that
Superior,
hard.
if I were
So-
part of drawing the lines.
Okay, so you're
Yeah.
saying the backyards of this boundary, the backyards of that, go 300 from that, that's what I'm hearing. You're saying
Right.
Monroe, what's the boundary west?
Well, I would say, I
The
think
other side of
this
the street.
district should include the Monroe Street houses to Superior. Like, if I were drawing it, that's how I
Yeah.
would see it. But,
Let's-
I mean, you don't have to go.
Just in case we add all the houses across the street from this district, just in case,
Yep,
go 300 feet from that.
got it.
Now, as a point of discussion, if I may, through
Yes.
you, one way we could approach the idea that we, want to give this guy his opportunity, but don't like his current lines, would be to make a motion to do it and vote it down, and then he has to redraw his lines. Or we can do that at the public hearing.
Well,
We can say,
Yeah.
we'll see how it plays out. It is kind of interesting.
so we're in
doing it
we're in
before we write
discussion.
the
There's been
legislature.
a motion made and seconded. So
Yes.
my part of the discussion is who, I think what I'm hearing, the concern is that maybe these boundaries aren't inclusive enough, aren't expansive enough, aren't big enough.
or too much.
Well, that's not what I heard to begin with. It was that it stopped at a street and should have gone across the street. So in my mind, that means bigger. And I'm not trying to be argumentative, but I guess my point is, if he says if he comes to the hearing and says, if we approve this motion, and he comes to the hearing and says, I really don't want to make it bigger. I don't need it any bigger. And I'm not so sure that the people across the street want this for their house.
It's our job to decide that. That's what we're paid for.
That's why, just let me finish, please.
Okay.
Please. So my question to you, Mr. Zuloff, is, are you gonna then make a motion to increase across the street when those people who might be here say, we don't want that for our house?
We have to consider that, yeah.
Okay.
And
All
this
right.
is the problem with, we got people who go to college for 4 years or get master's degrees in this stuff, and they can come up with good, sound proposals for very wise and educated reasons. And I think it's unwise for us to open the door for forcing us to deliberate every proposal from every non-professional exactly as presented, yes or no. That's just a bad way to make policy.
I have perhaps an idea that might help us here. Could I amend the motion to make it be a public hearing for the map brought forward by Jim at the next meeting, including at least overlapping this that he comes up with you?
We don't even have to have a public hearing. My point was we should deliberate this before we have a public hearing, or we don't even have to have the public hearing. We could work with the applicants, propose something without a public hearing and send it to, it's the city commission that has to have the public hearing.
Mr. Chairman, there's a motion that's been made, right?
Okay.
My feeling is, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. This is what he gave us. Let's vote, and let's either move forward or vote no, and then he's going to have to amend it and come back later.
And just to clarify.
I've just got a question.
Sure.
And not relative to this particular proposal, but is there a percentage of signatures you have to get to even bring this?
No.
We should have a percentage of signatures, I don't know, 70%, 80, whatever. We should have that. And I mean, before we move forward with these things, and the other question I had is, are these signatures, do we make sure they're homeowners, or are they getting renters' signatures? Because that makes a big difference in my mind. If the renters are signing it and we're approving things that renter, they got no stake in this. So I think those are things we ought to think about as we will moving forward. I just want to put that on the table.
Just to clarify a couple things, there's currently no process for a resident to bring a transient rental overlay district to you all, which is what we were talking about before. For transient rental overlay districts, unlike when we were talking about amendments to the zoning code that we were talking about legislation, to create a new transient rental overlay district, you do have to have a public hearing. The Planning Commission does have to have a public hearing.
Thank you, yes, I recall that now, yeah.
And so that's what we're talking about now, is to schedule a public hearing for this proposed transient rental overlay district. But to answer your question, Commissioner Pajali, there currently is no signature, but that could be something that we discuss in these proposed.
Yeah, I think that would be important because that might filter out some of this.
But it's still legislation. But in this case, the legislation requires a public hearing. I forgot about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I add one thing before you? I think you're going to call the question here soon, and that's probably not a bad idea. But is there something I could do to the motion, or maybe after this motion goes through, to allow him to alter this map before we bring it before you do your mailings, because I think that we all agree that the map could use a little bit of work.
You could make the motion, I believe, subject to.
No, you can make a motion to amend the motion.
So
You can make a
if I
motion to
may,
amend the motion, but
so we don't get bogged down in procedural stuff, if it is the desire of this commission to just schedule a public hearing, at that public hearing, you may consider proposed amendments to the proposed
So we don't even need.
You don't need to work out boundaries now. That could be a good topic of discussion for any interested parties at that hearing. I think you've more than covered any notice provisions. I actually think that at a very technical standpoint, even if we only did 300 feet from this boundary, we would be good and we would not have to renotice, but we will be extra careful just in case. And so that should cover any of that. And then at the public hearing, this discussion on specifics for the boundary would be really apt.
Okay.
I hope that answers all of your questions, so as to not do more
I'm going
motions.
to call the question. Now, again, I think I brought this up before, but I had originally talked to Mr. Maldonado as an attorney individually when he first questioned how to do this. So I feel I need to abstain.
Okay.
So I'm going to call the question, and I guess you're going to call my name, and I'm going to abstain for those reasons.
Mr. McGorry?
I abstain.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Pajali?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Mr. Zuloff?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to have a hearing.
2 hearings, right?
2 hearings, right. Well, hearing on that motion. And any other business? Hopefully not.
One comment. Mr. Chairman, you had asked staff to provide a presentation on transient requirements on what's permitted. There was some talk about RVs and if they were permitted on the First Street host site.
Thank you. Yes.
We have a memo that we are drafting that we will send to you via email. We thought it was more appropriate than presenting it tonight in front of everybody, stating what the code specifically calls out as permittable.
Okay, and my initial question, I think, was how it applied to potentially to boats. And then when I became aware of this potential RV park, I'll call it, on First Street, I'm not so sure that I see much difference between a boat and an RV, so I don't know. But yeah, I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, I'll specify,
Okay,
make it clear for everybody.
You can live on both of them.
pardon me?
You can live on either one.
Well, but no, as far as transient rental of them, yeah. So, anybody care to make a motion to adjourn?
Mr. Chairman, just one final comment. I would just like to thank staff for their patience. I know sometimes it's frustrating for all of us, so I appreciate your patience, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks for all the great
Thank you.
comments. Thank you.
Appreciate that.